My Own True Ghost Story by Rudyard Kipling. As I came through the desert, thus it was, as I came through the desert, the city of dreadful night. Somewhere in the other world where there are books and pictures and plays and shop windows to look at, and thousands of men who spend their lives in building up all four, lives a gentleman who writes real stories about the real insides of people, and his name is Mr. Walter Besant. But he will insist upon treating his ghosts, he has published half a workshop full of them, with levity. He makes his ghost seers talk familiarly, and, in some cases, flirt outrageously with the phantoms. You may treat anything, from a viceroy to a vernacular paper, with levity. But you must behave reverently toward a ghost, and particularly an Indian one. There are, in this land, ghosts who take the form of fat, cold pobby horses and hide in trees near the roadside till a traveler passes. Then they drop upon his neck and remain. There are also terrible ghosts of women who have died in childbed. These wander along the pathways at dusk, or hide in the crops near a village, and call seductively. But to answer their call is death in this world and the next. Their feet are turned backward, that all sober men may recognize them. There are ghosts of little children who have been thrown into wells. These haunt well curbs and the fringes of jungles, and wail under the stars, or catch women by the wrist and beg to be taken up and carried. These and the corpse ghosts, however, are only vernacular articles and do not attack sahibs. No native ghost has yet been authentically reported to have frightened an Englishman. But many English ghosts have scared the life out of both white and black. Nearly every other station owns a ghost. There are said to be 2 at Simla, not counting the woman who blows the bellows at Sairi Dak Bungalow on the old road. Mussoorie has a house haunted of a very lively thing. A white lady is supposed to do night watchman round a house in Lahore. Dalhousie says that one of her houses repeats on autumn evenings all the incidents of a horrible horse and precipice accident. Murree has a merry ghost, and now that she has been swept by cholera, will have room for a sorrowful one. There are officers' quarters in the Myanmar whose doors open without reason, and whose furniture is guaranteed to creak, not with the heat of June, but with the weight of invisibles who come to lounge in the chairs. Peshawar possesses houses that none will willingly rent, and there is something, not fever, wrong with a big bungalow in Allahabad. The older provinces simply bristle with haunted houses, and march phantom armies along their main thoroughfares. Some of the dock bungalows on the Grand Trunk Road have handy little cemeteries in their compound, witnesses to the changes and chances of this mortal life in the days when men drove from Calcutta to the northwest. These bungalows are objectionable places to put up in. They are generally very old, always dirty, while the khansama is as ancient as the bungalow. He either chatters senilely or falls into the long trances of age. In both moods he is useless. If you get angry with him, he refers to some sahib dead and buried these 30 years, and says that when he was in that sahib's service, not a khansama in the province could touch him. Then he jabbers and mows and trembles and fidgets among the dishes, and you repent of your irritation. In these dock bungalows, ghosts are most likely to be found, and when found, they should be made a note of. Not long ago, it was my business to live in dock bungalows. I never inhabited the same house for 3 nights running, and grew to be learned in the breed. I lived in government-built ones with red brick walls and rail ceilings, an inventory of the furniture posted in every room, and an excited snake at the threshold to give welcome. I lived in converted ones, old houses officiating as dock bungalows, where nothing was in its proper place, and there wasn't even a fowl for dinner. I lived in second-hand palaces, where the wind blew through open-work marble tracery just as uncomfortably as through a broken pane. I lived in dock bungalows where the last entry in the visitor's book was 15 months old, and where they slashed off the curry kid's head with a sword. It was my good luck to meet all sorts of men, from sober traveling missionaries and deserters flying from British regiments, to drunken loafers who threw whiskey bottles at all who passed, and my still greater good fortune just to escape a maternity case. Seeing that a fair proportion of the tragedy of our lives out here acted itself in dock bungalows, I wondered that I had met no ghosts. A ghost that would voluntarily hang about a dock bungalow would be mad, of course, but so many men have died mad in dock bungalows that there must be a fair percentage of lunatic ghosts. In due time, I found my ghost, or ghosts, rather, for there were two of them. Up till that hour, I had sympathized with Mr. Besant's method of handling them, as shown in The Strange Case of Mr. Lovecraft and other stories. I am now in the opposition. We will call the bungalow Catmull Dock Bungalow. But that was the smallest part of the horror. A man with a sensitive hide has no right to sleep in dock bungalows. He should marry. Catmull Dock Bungalow was old and rotten and unrepaired. The floor was of worn brick, the walls were filthy, and the windows were nearly black with grime. It stood on a bypath largely used by native sub-deputy assistants of all kinds, from finance to forests. But real sahibs were rare. The Kamsama, who was nearly bent double with old age, said so. When I arrived, there was a fitful, undecided rain on the face of the land, accompanied by a restless wind, and every gust made a noise like the rattling of dry bones in the stiff toddy palms outside. The Kansama completely lost his head on my arrival. He had served a sahib once. Did I know that sahib? He gave me the name of a well-known man who has been buried for more than a quarter of a century, and showed me an ancient daguerreotype of that man in his prehistoric youth. I had seen a steel engraving of him at the head of a double volume of memoirs a month before, and I felt ancient beyond telling. The day shut in, and the Kansama went to get me food. He did not go through the pretense of calling it kana, man's victuals. He said ratub, and that means, among other things, grub, dog's rations. There was no insult in his choice of the term. He had forgotten the other word, I suppose. While he was cutting up the dead bodies of animals, I settled myself down, after exploring the dock bungalow. There were 3 rooms beside my own, which was a corner kennel, each giving into the other through dingy white doors fastened with long iron bars. The bungalow was a very solid one, but the partition walls of the rooms were almost jerry-built in their flimsiness. Every step or bang of a trunk echoed from my room down the other 3, and every footfall came back tremulously from the far walls. For this reason I shut the door. There were no lamps, only candles and long glass shades. An oil wick was set in the bathroom. For bleak, unadulterated misery, that dock bungalow was the worst of the many that I had ever set foot in. There was no fireplace, and the windows would not open, so a brazier of charcoal would have been useless. The rain and the wind splashed and gurgled and moaned round the house, and the toddy palms rattled and roared. Half a dozen jackals went through the compound singing, and a hyena stood afar off and mocked them. A hyena would convince a Sadducee of the resurrection of the dead, the worst sort of dead. Then came the ratub, a curious meal, half native and half English in composition, with the old Kansama babbling behind my chair about dead and gone English people, and the wind-blown candles playing shadow bo peep with the bed and the mosquito curtains. It was just the sort of dinner and evening to make a man think of every single one of his past sins, and of all the others that he intended to commit if he lived. Sleep, for several hundred reasons, was not easy. The lamp in the bathroom threw the most absurd shadows into the room, and the wind was beginning to talk nonsense. Just when the reasons were drowsy with blood-sucking, I heard the regular, "Let us take and heave him over," grunt of dually bearers in the compound. First, one dually came in, and then a second, and then a third. I heard the dualies dumped on the ground, and the shutter in front of my door shook. "That's someone trying to come in," I said. But no one spoke, and I persuaded myself that it was the gusty wind. The shutter of the room next to mine was attacked, flung back, and the inner door opened. "That's some sub-deputy assistant," I said, "and he has brought his friends with him. Now they'll talk and spit and smoke for an hour." But there were no voices and no footsteps. No one was putting his luggage into the next room. The door shut, and I thanked Providence that I was to be left in peace. But I was curious to know where the dualies had gone. I got out of bed and looked into the darkness. There was never a sign of a dually. Just as I was getting into bed again, I heard, in the next room, the sound that no man in his senses can possibly mistake. The whir of a billiard ball down the length of the slates when the striker is stringing for break. No other sound is like it. A minute afterward, there was another whir, and I got into bed. I was not frightened. Indeed, I was not. I was very curious to know what had become of the dualies. I jumped into bed for that reason. Next minute I heard the double click of a cannon, and my hair sat up. It is a mistake to say that hair stands up. The skin of the head tightens, and you can feel a faint, prickly, bristling all over the scalp. That is the hair sitting up. There was a whir and a click, and both sounds could only have been made by one thing, a billiard ball. I argued the matter out at great length with myself, and the more I argued, the less probable it seemed that one bed, one table, and two chairs, all the furniture of the room next to mine, could so exactly duplicate the sounds of a game of billiards. After another cannon, a three-cushion one to judge by the whir, I argued no more. I had found my ghost and would have given worlds to have escaped from that dock bungalow. I listened, and with each listen the game grew clearer. There was whir on whir and click on click. Sometimes there was a double click and a whir and another click. Beyond any sort of doubt, people were playing billiards in the next room, and the next room was not big enough to hold a billiard table. Between the pauses of the wind, I heard the game go forward, stroke after stroke. I tried to believe that I could not hear voices, but that attempt was a failure. Do you know what fear is? Not ordinary fear of insult, injury, or death, but abject, quivering dread of something that you cannot see. Fear that dries the inside of the mouth and half of the throat. Fear that makes you sweat on the palms of the hands and gulp in order to keep the uvula at work. This is a fine fear, a great cowardice, and must be felt to be appreciated. The very improbability of billiards in a dock bungalow proved the reality of the thing. No man, drunk or sober, could imagine a game at billiards or invent the spitting crack of a screw cannon. A severe course of dock bungalows has this disadvantage. It breeds infinite credulity. If a man said to a confirmed dock bungalow haunter, "There is a corpse in the next room, and there's a mad girl in the next but one, and the woman and man on that camel have just eloped from a place 60 miles away," the hearer would not disbelieve, because he would know that nothing is too wild, grotesque, or horrible to happen in a dock bungalow. This credulity, unfortunately, extends to ghosts. A rational person, fresh from his own house, would have turned on his side and slept. I did not. So surely as I was given up as a bad carcass by the scores of things in the bed, because the bulk of my blood was in my heart, so surely did I hear every stroke of a long game at billiards, played in the echoing room behind the iron-barred door. My dominant fear was that the players might want a marker. It was an absurd fear, because creatures who could play in the dark would be above such superfluities. I only know that that was my terror, and it was real. After a long, long while, the game stopped, and the door banged. I slept because I was dead tired. Otherwise, I should have preferred to have kept awake. Not for everything in Asia would I have dropped the door bar and peered into the dark of the next room. When the morning came, I considered that I had done well and wisely, and inquired for the means of departure. "By the way, Kansama," I said, "what were those 3 doolies doing in my compound in the night?" "There were no doolies," said the Kansama. I went into the next room, and the daylight streamed through the open door. I was immensely brave. I would, at that hour, have played black pool with the owner of the big black pool down below. "Has this place always been a dak bungalow?" I asked. "No," said the Kansama. 10 or 20 years ago, I have forgotten how long, it was a billiard room." "A how much?" "A billiard room for the sahibs who built the railway. I was Kansama then, in the big house where all the railway sahibs lived, and I used to come across with brandy shrab. These 3 rooms were all one, and they held a big table on which the sahibs played every evening. But the sahibs are all dead now, and the railway runs, you say, nearly to Kabul." "Do you remember anything about the sahibs?" "It is long ago, but I remember that one sahib, a fat man and always angry, was playing here one night, and he said to me, 'Mango Khan, brandy pani do,' and I filled the glass, and he bent over the table to strike, and his head fell lower and lower till it hit the table, and his spectacles came off, and when we, the sahibs and I myself, ran to lift him, he was dead. I helped to carry him out. Aha, he was a strong sahib. But he is dead, and I, old Mango Khan, am still living, by your favor." That was more than enough. I had my ghost, a first-hand, authenticated article. I would write to the Society for Psychical Research. I would paralyze the empire with the news. But I would, first of all, put 80 miles of assessed cropland between myself and that dak bungalow, before nightfall. The Society might send their regular agent to investigate later on. I went into my own room and prepared to pack after noting down the facts of the case. As I smoked, I heard the game begin again, with a miss and balk this time, for the whir was a short one. The door was open, and I could see into the room. Click, click! That was a cannon. I entered the room without fear, for there was sunlight within, and a fresh breeze without. The unseen game was going on at a tremendous rate. And well it might, when a restless little rat was running to and fro inside the dingy ceiling cloth, and a piece of loose window sash was making 50 breaks off the window bolt as it shook in the breeze. Impossible to mistake the sound of billiard balls? Impossible to mistake the whir of a ball over the slate? But I was to be excused. Even when I shut my enlightened eyes, the sound was marvelously like that of a fast game. Entered angrily the faithful partner of my sorrows, Kadir Baksh. "This bungalow is very bad and low cost. No wonder the presence was disturbed and is speckled. 3 sets of dooley bearers came to the bungalow late last night when I was sleeping outside, and said that it was their custom to rest in the rooms set apart for the English people. What honor has the Kansama? They tried to enter, but I told them to go. No wonder if these Orias had been here that the presence is sorely spotted. It is a shame, and the work of a dirty man." Kaider Bosch did not say that he had taken from each gang 2 annas for rent in advance, and then, beyond my earshot, had beaten them with the big green umbrella whose use I could never before divine. But Kaidir Bosch has no notions of morality. There was an interview with the Kansama, but as he promptly lost his head, wrath gave place to pity, and pity led to a long conversation, in the course of which he put the fat engineer sahib's tragic death in 3 separate stations, 2 of them 50 miles away. The 3rd shift was to Calcutta, and there the sahib died while driving a dog cart. If I had encouraged him, the Kansama would have wandered all through Bengal with his corpse. I did not go away as soon as I intended. I stayed for the night, while the wind and the rat and the sash and the window bolt played a ding-dong 150 up. Then the wind ran out and the billiard stopped, and I felt that I had ruined my one genuine, hallmarked ghost story. Had I only stopped at the proper time, I could have made anything out of it. That was the bitterest thought of all.
When I Was Dead by Vincent O'Sullivan. That was the worst of Ravenel Hall. The passages were long and gloomy. The rooms were musty and dull. Even the pictures were somber and their subjects dire. On an autumn evening, when the wind soughed and wailed through the trees in the park, and the dead leaves whistled and chattered, while the rain clamored at the windows, small wonder that the folks with gentle nerves went astraying in their wits. An acute nervous system is a grievous burden on the deck of a yacht under sunlit skies. At Ravenel, the chain of nerves was prone to clash and jangle a funeral march. Nerves must be pampered in a tea-drinking community, and the ghost that your grandfather, with a skinful of port, could face and never tremble, sets you, in your sobriety, sweating and shivering, or, becoming scared, poor ghost, of your bulged eyes and dropping jaw, he quenches expectation by not appearing at all. So I am left to conclude that it was tea which made my acquaintance afraid to stay at Ravenel. Even Wilvern gave over, and as he is in the Guards, and a polo player, his nerves ought to be strong enough. On the night before he went, I was explaining to him my theory that if you place some drops of human blood near you, and then concentrate your thoughts, you will, after a while, see before you a man or woman who will stay with you during long hours of the night, and even meet you at unexpected places during the day. I was explaining this theory, I repeat, when he interrupted me with words, senseless enough, which sent me fencing and parrying strangers, on my guard. "I say, Alastair, my dear chap," he began, "you ought to get out of this place and go up to town and knock about a bit. You really ought, you know." "Yes," I replied, "and get poisoned at the hotels by bad food, and at the clubs by bad talk, I suppose? No, thank you. And let me say that your care for my health enervates me." "Well, you can do as you like," says he, rapping with his feet on the floor. "I'm hanged if I stay here after tomorrow. I'll be staring mad if I do." He was my last visitor. Some weeks after his departure, I was sitting in the library with my drops of blood by me. I had got my theory nearly perfect by this time, but there was one difficulty. The figure which I had ever before me was the figure of an old woman with her hair divided in the middle, and her hair fell to her shoulders, white on one side and black on the other. She was a very complete old woman, but alas, she was eyeless, and when I tried to construct the eyes, she would shrivel and rot in my sight. But tonight I was thinking as I had never thought before, and the eyes were just creeping into the head when I heard a terrible crash outside, as if some heavy substance had fallen. Of a sudden the door was flung open, and two maidservants entered. They glanced at the rug under my chair, and at that they turned a sick white, cried on God, and huddled out. "How dare you enter the library in this manner?" I demanded sternly. No answer came back from them, so I started in pursuit. I found all the servants in the house gathered in a knot at the end of the passage. "Mrs. Pebble," I said smartly to the housekeeper, "I want those two women discharged tomorrow. It's an outrage. You ought to be more careful." But she was not attending to me. Her face was distorted with terror. Ah, dear, she went. "We had better all go to the library together," she says to the others. "Am I master of my own house, Mrs. Pebble?" I inquired, bringing my knuckles down with a bang on the table. None of them seemed to see me or hear me. I might as well have been shrieking in a desert. I followed them down the passage and forbade them to enter the library. But they trooped past me and stood with a clutter round the hearth-rug. Then 3 or 4 of them began dragging and lifting, as if they were lifting a helpless body, and stumbled with their imaginary burden over to a sofa. Old Soames the butler stood near. "Poor young gentleman," he said with a sob. "I've knowed him since he was a baby. And to think of him being dead like this, and so young, too." I crossed the room. "What's all this, Soames?" I cried, shaking him roughly by the shoulders. "I'm not dead! I'm here! Here!" As he did not stir, I got a little scared. "Soames, old friend," I called. "Don't you know me? Don't you know the little boy you used to play with? Say I'm not dead, Soames. Please, Soames." He stooped down and kissed the sofa. "I think one of the men ought to ride over to the village for the doctor, Mr. Soames," says Mrs. Pebble, and he shuffled out to give the order. Now, this doctor was an ignorant dog, whom I'd been forced to exclude from the house because he went about proclaiming his belief in a saving God at the same time that he proclaimed himself a man of science. He, I was resolved, should never cross my threshold, but I followed Mrs. Pebble through the house, screaming out prohibition. But I did not catch even a groan from her, not a nod of the head, nor a cast of the eye, to show that she had heard. I met the doctor at the door of the library. "Well," I sneered, throwing my hand in his face, "have you come to teach me some new prayers?" He brushed by me as if he had not felt the blow, and knelt down by the sofa. "Rupture of a vessel on the brain, I think," he says to Soames and Mrs. Pebble after a short moment. "He has been dead some hours, poor fellow. You had better telegraph for his sister, and I will send up the undertaker to arrange the body." "You liar!" I yelled. "You whining liar! How have you the insolence to tell my servants that I am dead, when you see me here face to face?" He was far in the passage with Soames and Mrs. Pebble at his heels, ere I had ended, and not one of the three turned round. All that night I sat in the library. Strangely enough, I had no wish to sleep, nor during the time that followed had I any craving to eat. In the morning the men came, and although I ordered them out, they proceeded to minister about something I could not see. So all day I stayed in the library, or wandered about the house, and at night the men came again, bringing with them a coffin. Then, in my humor, thinking it a shame that so fine a coffin should be empty, I lay the night in it, and slept a soft, dreamless sleep, the softest sleep I have ever slept. Then the men came the next day. I rested still, and the undertaker shaved me, a strange valet. On the evening after that, I was coming downstairs when I noted some luggage in the hall, and so learned that my sister had arrived. I had not seen this woman since her marriage, and I loathed her more than I loathed any creature in this ill-organized world. She was very beautiful, I think, tall and dark and straight as a ramrod, and she had an unruly passion for scandal and dress. I suppose the reason I disliked her so intensely was that she had a habit of making one aware of her presence when she was several yards off. At 9:30, my sister came down to the library in a very charming wrap, and I soon found that she was as insensible to my presence as the others. I trembled with rage to see her kneel down by the coffin, my coffin. But when she bent over to kiss the pillow, I threw away control. A knife which had been used to cut string was lying upon a table. I seized it and drove it into her neck. She fled from the room, screaming. "Come, come!" she cried, her voice quivering with anguish. "The corpse is bleeding from the nose!" Then I cursed her. On the evening of the third day, there was a heavy fall of snow. About 11 o'clock, I observed that the house was filled with blacks and mutes and folk of the country, who came for the obsequies. I went into the library and sat still and waited. Soon came the men, and they closed the lid of the coffin and bore it out on their shoulders. And yet I sat, feeling rather sadly that something of mine had been taken away. I could not quite think what. For half an hour, perhaps, dreaming. And then I glided to the hall door. There was no trace left of the funeral, but after a while I sighted a black thread winding slowly across the white plain. "I am not dead," I moaned, and rubbed my face in the pure snow and tossed it on my neck and hair. "Sweet God, I am not dead!"
How He Caught the Ghost by Bob Holland. Yes, "The house is a good one," said the agent. "It's in a good neighborhood, and you're getting it at almost nothing. But I think it right to tell you all about it. You are orphans, you say, and with the mother dependent on you? That makes all the more necessary that you should know. The fact is, the house is said to be haunted." The agent could not help smiling as he said it, and he was relieved to see an answering smile on the two faces before him. "Ah, you don't believe in ghosts," he went on, "nor do I for that matter, but somehow the reputation of the house keeps me from having a tenant long at a time. The place ought to rent for twice as much as it does. If we succeed in driving out the ghost, you will not raise the rent?" asked the boy, with a merry twinkle in his eyes. "Well, no, not this year at any rate," laughed the agent. And so the house was rented, and the slip of a girl and the tall lad, her brother, went their way. Within a week the family had moved into the house and were delighted with it. It was large and cool, with wide halls and fine stairways, and with more room than they needed. But that did not matter in the least, for they had always been cramped in small houses, suffering many discomforts, and they never could have afforded such a place as this if it had not been haunted. "Blessings on the ghost!" cried Margaret gaily as she ran about, as merry as a child. "Who would be without a ghost in the house when it brings one like this?" "And it's so near your school," said the mother, "and I used to worry so over the long walk. And David can come home to lunch now, and you don't know what a pleasure that will be." "It seems to me," David gravely explained, "that if I should meet the ghost, I would treat him with the greatest politeness and encourage him to stay. We shall not miss the room he takes, shall we? I think it would be well to set aside that room over yours, Maggie, for his ghostship's own, for we shall not need that, you know. Besides, the door doesn't shut, and he can go in and out without breaking the lock." And then they all laughed and had a great deal of fun over the ghost, which was a great joke to them. They were very tired that night and slept soundly all night long. When they met the next morning, there was more laughter about the ghost, which was shy about meeting strangers, probably, and had made no effort to introduce himself. For the next 3 days they were all hard at work, trying to bring chaos into something like order, and then it was time for the school to open, and Margaret was to begin teaching, and David inserted an advertisement in the city's papers for a maid of all work who might help their mother in their absence. For one whole day prospective colored servants presented themselves and announced, "Is this the house where they want a work lady? No, ma'am, I ain't going to work in this house. Catch me working in no haunted house." After which they each and all departed, and others came in their stead. One was secured after a while, but no sooner had she talked across the fence with the neighbor's servant than she too departed. "Never mind, children," said Miss Craig wearily. "I would much rather do the work than be troubled in this way." So the maid of all work was dismissed, and the Craig family locked the doors and went into their rooms, worn out with the day's anxieties. They had been in the house 4 days, and there had been neither sight nor sound of the ghost. The very mention of it was enough to start them all to laughing, for they were thoroughly practical people, with a fondness for inquiring into anything that seemed mysterious to them, and for understanding it thoroughly before they let it go. David was soon sleeping the sound sleep of healthy boyhood, and all was silent in the house, when Margaret stole softly into his room and laid her hand on his arm. He was not easy to waken, and several minutes had passed before he sat up in bed with an articulate murmur of surprise. "Hush," said Margaret in a whisper, with her hand on his lips. "I want you to come into my room and listen to a sound that I've been hearing for some time." "Doors creaking?" suggested David as he began to dress. "Nothing of the kind," was all she said. They walked up the stairway and along the upper hall to the door of the unused room. Something was wrong with the lock, and the door would not stay fastened, as I have said. Something that was not fear thrilled their hearts as they pushed the door further ajar and stood where they could see every foot of the vacant floor. One of their own boxes stood in the middle of the room, but aside from that, nothing was to be seen, and they looked at one another in silence. "Hold the lamp a minute, Maggie," David said at last, and then he went all over the room and looked more particularly at its emptiness, and even felt the walls. "Secret panels, you know," he said with a smile, but it was a very puzzled smile indeed. "I can't see what it could have been," Margaret said as they went down the stairs. "No, I can't see either, but I'm going to see," said David. "That was a chain, and chains don't drag around by themselves, you know. A ghost could not drag a chain if he were to try." "The conventional ghost very often drags chains," said Margaret as she closed the door of her room. And then she lay awake all night and listened for the conventional ghost that dragged a chain, but it seemed that the weight of the chain must have wearied him, for he was not heard again. The mother had slept through it all, and the next morning they gave her a vivid account of the night's adventure. "Perhaps it was someone in the house," she said in alarm. There were no ghosts within the bounds of possibility so far as she was concerned, but burglars were very possible indeed. Then Margaret and David both laughed more than ever. "What fun it would be," said David, "for a burglar to get into the house and try to find something worth carrying away." So they went on to the next night, all three fully determined to spend the night in listening for the ghost and running him to earth if possible. But it was Margaret that heard the ghost after all. She had been sleeping and was suddenly startled wide awake, and there, overhead, was the sound of the chain dragging, and just as she was on the point of springing out of bed to call her brother, the chain seemed to go out of the upper room. She lay still and listened, and in a moment she heard it again. It was coming down the stairs. There was no carpet on the stairs, and she could hear the chain drop from step to step until it had come the whole way down. There it was, almost at the door of her room, and something that was strangely like fear kept her lying still, listening in horrified silence. Then it went along the hall, dragging close to the door, then further away, and back and forth for a while, and then it began dragging back up the stairs again. Step by step, she could hear it drawn over the edge of every step, and by the time it had reached the top, she remembered herself and called David. Again did the brother and sister make a tour of the upper room with the lamp. Not only that, but they looked into every nook and corner of the upper part of the house, and at last came back, baffled. They had seen nothing extraordinary, and they had not heard a sound. "I'm going to see that ghost tonight," David said to his sister the next evening. "How?" "I'm going to sit up all night at the head of the stairs. Don't say anything about it to Mother. It might make her uneasy." So, after the household were all quiet, David slipped into his place at the head of the stairs and sat down to his vigil. He had placed a screen at the head of the stairway so that it hid him from view, as if a ghost cared for a screen, and established himself behind it and prepared to be as patient as he could. It seemed to him that hours so long had never been devised as those the town clocks told off that night. He bore it until midnight moderately well, because, he argued with himself, if there were any ghosts about, they would surely walk then. But they were not in a humor for walking, and still the hours rolled on without any developments. He took the fidgets and had nervous twitches all over him. At last he could endure it no longer, and had leaned his head back against the wall, and was going blissfully to sleep, when he heard a chain dragging just beyond the open door of that unused room. In spite of himself, a shiver ran down his back. There was no mistaking it. It was a real chain if he had ever heard one. More than that, it had left the room and was coming straight toward the stairs. The hall was dark, and it was impossible for him to see anything, although he strained his eyes in the direction of the sound. And even while he looked, it had passed behind the screen and was going down the stairs, dropping from step soft step with a clank. Halfway down a narrow strip of moonlight from a stair window lay directly across the steps. Whatever the thing was, it must pass through that patch of light, and David leaned forward and watched. Down it went from step to step, and presently it had slipped through the light and was down, and a little later it came back again, through the light and up the stairs and back into that unused room. And then David slapped his knees jubilantly and ran down to his room and slept all the rest of the night. Next morning he was very mysterious about his discoveries of the night before. "Oh, yes, I saw the ghost," he said to Maggie. "There, don't ask so many questions. I'll tell you more about it tomorrow, maybe." And that was all the information she could get from him. It was very provoking. That day David made a purchase downtown and brought home a bulky bundle, which he hid in his own room and would not let his sister even peep at. "I'm going to try to catch a ghost tonight," he said, "and you know how it is. If I brag too much beforehand, I shall be sure to fail." He was working with something in the hall after the others had retired, but he did not sit up this time. He went to bed, and Margaret listened at his door and found that he was soon asleep. But away in the night they were all wakened by a squealing that brought them to the hall in a great hurry, and there at the head of the stairs they found the huge rat trap that David had set a few hours before, and in the midst of the toils was a rat. "Why, David," exclaimed the mother, "I didn't know there was a rat in the house." And then, all at once, she saw that there was a long chain hanging from a little iron collar around the creature's neck, and she and Margaret cried together, "And this was the ghost!" Such a funny ghost when they came to think of it. This poor rat, with a nest in some hole of the broken chimney. He had been someone's pet once, perhaps. And now the households he had broken up, the nights he had disturbed, the wild sensations he had created. It made his captors laugh to think that this innocent creature had been the cause of the whole trouble. "I'll get a cage for him and take care of him for the rest of his life," said David. "We owe him so much that we can't afford to be ungrateful." The next morning he took the ghost in a cage and showed it to the agent and gave him a vivid account of the capture. "So, you have a good house for about half the price all on account of that rat," exclaimed the agent grimly. "Young man, but never mind, you deserve it. What are you working for now? $6 a week? If you ever want to change your place, suppose you come around here. I think you need a business that will give you a chance to grow." And the agent and David shook hands warmly over the cage of the ghost. The Phantom Hag by Bob Holland. The other evening in an old castle, the conversation turned upon apparitions, each one of the party telling a story. As the accounts grew more horrible, the young ladies drew closer together. "Have you ever had an adventure with a ghost?" said they to me. "Do you not know a story to make us shiver? Come, tell us something." "I am quite willing to do so," I replied. "I will tell you of an incident that happened to myself. Toward the close of the autumn of 1858, I visited one of my friends, sub-prefect of a little city in the center of France. Albert was an old companion of my youth, and I had been present at his wedding. His charming wife was full of goodness and grace. My friend wished to show me his happy home and to introduce me to his two pretty little daughters. I was feted and taken great care of. 3 days after my arrival, I knew the entire city, curiosities, old castles, ruins, etc. Every day about 4 o'clock, Albert would order the phaeton, and we would take a long ride, returning home in the evening. One evening my friend said to me, "Tomorrow we will go further than usual. I want to take you to the Black Rocks. They are curious old druidical stones on a wide and desolate plain. They will interest you. My wife has not seen them yet, so we will take her." The following day we drove out at the usual hour. Albert's wife sat by his side. I occupied the back seat alone. The weather was gray and somber that afternoon, and the journey was not very pleasant. When we arrived at the Black Rocks, the sun was setting. We got out of the phaeton, and Albert took care of the horses. We walked some little distance through the fields before reaching the great remains of the old Druid religion. Albert's wife wished to climb to the summit of the altar, and I assisted her. I can still see her graceful figure as she stood draped in a red shawl, her veil floating around her. "How beautiful it is! But does it not make you feel a little melancholy?" said she, extending her hand toward the dark horizon, which was lighted a little by the last rays of the sun. The afternoon wind blew violently and sighed through the stunted trees that grew around the stone cromlechs. Not a dwelling nor human being was in sight. We hastened to get down and silently retraced our steps to the carriage. "We must hurry," said Albert. "The sky is threatening, and we shall have scarcely time to reach home before night." We carefully wrapped the robes around his wife. She tied the veil around her face, and the horses started into a rapid trot. It was growing dark. The scenery around us was bare and desolate. Clumps of fir trees here and there and furze bushes formed the only vegetation. We began to feel the cold, for the wind blew with fury, and the only sound we heard was the steady trot of horses and the sharp, clear tinkle of their bells. Suddenly I felt the heavy grasp of a hand upon my shoulder. I turned my head quickly. A horrible apparition presented itself before my eyes. In the empty place at my side sat a hideous woman. I tried to cry out. The phantom placed her fingers upon her lips to impose silence upon me. I could not utter a sound. The woman was clothed in white linen. Her head was cowled. Her face was overspread with a corpse-like pallor, and in place of her eyes were ghastly black cavities. I sat motionless, overcome by terror. The ghost suddenly stood up and leaned over the young wife. She encircled her with her arms and lowered her hideous head as if to kiss her forehead. "What a wind!" cried Madame Albert, turning precipitately toward me. "My veil is torn." As she turned, I felt the same infernal pressure on my shoulder, and the place occupied by the phantom was empty. I looked out to the right and left. The road was deserted, not an object in sight. "What a dreadful gale," said Madame Albert. "Did you feel it? I cannot explain the terror that seized me. My veil was torn by the wind as if by an invisible hand, and I'm trembling still." "Never mind," said Albert, smiling. "Wrap yourself up, my dear. We will soon be warming ourselves by a good fire at home. I am starving." A cold perspiration covered my forehead. A shiver ran through me. My tongue clove to the roof of my mouth, and I could not articulate a sound. A sharp pain in my shoulder was the only sensible evidence that I was not the victim of a hallucination. Putting my hand on my aching shoulder, I felt a rent in the cloak that was wrapped around me. I looked at it. 5 perfectly distinct holes. Visible traces of the grip of the horrible phantom. I thought for a moment that I should die, that my reason should leave me. It was, I think, the most dreadful moment of my life. Finally, I became more calm. This nameless agony had lasted for some minutes. I do not think it is possible for a human being to suffer more than I did during that time. As soon as I had recovered my senses, I thought I would first tell my friends all that had passed, but hesitated, and finally did not, fearing that my story would frighten Madame Albert, and feeling sure that my friend would not believe me. The lights of the little city revived me, and gradually the oppression of terror that overwhelmed me became lighter. As soon as we reached home, Madame Albert untied her veil. It was literally in shreds. I hoped to find my clothes whole and prove it to myself that it was all imagination. But no. The cloth was torn in 5 places, just where the fingers had seized my shoulder. There was no mark, however, upon my flesh, only a dull pain. I returned to Paris the next day, where I endeavored to forget the strange adventure, or at least when I thought of it, I would force myself to think of it as a hallucination. The day after my return, I received a letter from my friend Albert. It was edged with black. I opened it with a vague fear. His wife had died the day of my return.
A Phantom Toe by W. Bob Holland. I am not a superstitious man. Far from it. But despite all my efforts to the contrary, I could not help thinking, directly I had taken a survey of my chamber, that I should never quit it without going through a strange adventure. There was something in its immense size, heaviness, and gloom that seemed to annihilate at one blow all my resolute skepticism as regards supernatural visitations. It appeared to me totally impossible to go into that room and disbelieve in ghosts. The fact is, I had incautiously partaken at supper of that favorite Dutch dish, sauerkraut, and I suppose it had disagreed with me and put strange fancies into my head. Be this as it may, I only know that after parting with my friend for the night, I gradually worked myself up into such a state of fidgetiveness that at last I wasn't sure whether I hadn't become a ghost myself. Supposing, ruminated I, supposing the landlord himself should be a practical robber, and should have taken the lock and the bolt from off this door for the purpose of entering here in the dead of night, abstracting all my property, and perhaps murdering me. I thought the dog had a very cutthroat air about him. Now, I had never had any such idea until that moment, for my host was a fat, all Dutchmen are fat, stupid-looking fellow, who I don't believe had sense enough to understand what a robbery or murder meant. But somehow or other, whenever we have anything really to annoy us, and it certainly was not pleasant to go to bed in a strange place without being able to fasten one's door, we are sure to aggravate it by myriads of chimerias of our own brain. So, on the present occasion, in the midst of 1,000 disagreeable reveries, some of the most wild absurdity, I jumped very gloomily into bed, having first put out my candle, for total darkness was far preferable to its flickering, ghostly light, which transformed rather than revealed objects, and soon fell asleep, perfectly tired out with my day's writing. How long I lay asleep I don't know, but I suddenly woke with a disagreeable dream of cutthroats, ghosts, and long, winding passages in a haunted inn. An indescribable feeling, such as I have never before experienced, hung upon me. It seemed as if every nerve in my body had 100 spirits tickling it, and this was accompanied by so great a heat that, inwardly cursing my host's sauerkraut and wondering how the Dutchman could endure such poison, I was forced to sit up in bed to cool myself. The whole of the room was profoundly dark, except at one place, where the moon, falling through a crevice in the shutters, threw a straight line of about an inch or so thick upon the floor, clear, sharp, and intensely brilliant against the darkness. I leave you to conceive my horror when, upon looking at this said line of light, I saw there a naked human toe. Nothing more. For the first instant I thought the vision must be some effect of moonlight, then that I was only half awake and could not see distinctly. So I rubbed my eyes 2 or 3 times and looked again. Still, there was the accursed thing, plain, distinct, immovable, marble-like in its fixedness and rigidity, but in everything else horribly human. I am not an easily frightened man. No one who has traveled so much, and seen so much, and been exposed to so many dangers as I, can be. But there was something so mysterious and unusual in the appearance of this single toe, that for a short time I could not think what to be at. So I did nothing but stare at it in a state of utter bewilderment. At length, however, as the toe did not vanish under my steady gaze, I thought I might as well change my tactics, and remembering that all midnight invaders, be they thieves, ghosts, or devils, dislike nothing so much as a good noise, I shouted out in a loud voice, "Who's there?" The toe immediately disappeared in the darkness. Almost simultaneously with my words, I leapt out of bed and rushed toward the place where I had beheld the strange appearance. The next instant I ran against something and felt an iron grip round my body. After this, I have no distinct recollection of what occurred, except that a fearful surge ensued between me and my unseen opponent, that every now and then we were violently hurled to the floor, from which we always rose again in an instant, locked in a deadly embrace, that we tugged and strained and pulled and pushed, I in the convulsion and frantic energy of a fight for life, he, for by this time I had discovered that the intruder was a human being, actuated by some passion of which I was ignorant, that we whirled round and round, cheek to cheek, arm to arm, in fierce contest, until the room appeared to whiz around with us, and that at least a dozen people, my fellow traveler among them, roused, I suppose, by our repeated falls, came pouring into the room with lights, and showed me struggling with a man having nothing on but a shirt, whose long, tangled hair and wild, unsettled eyes told me he was insane. And then, for the first time, I became aware that I had received, in the conflict, several gashes from a knife, which my opponent still held in his hand. To conclude my story in a few words, for I dare say all of you by this time are getting very tired, it turned out that my midnight visitor was a madman, who was being conveyed to a lunatic asylum at The Hague, and that he and his keeper had been obliged to stop at Delft on their way. The poor fellow had contrived during the night to escape from his keeper, who had carelessly forgotten to lock the door of his chamber, and with that irresistible desire to shed blood peculiar to many insane people, had possessed himself of a pocket-knife belonging to the man who had charge of him, entered my room, which was most likely the only one in the house unfastened, and was probably meditating the final stroke when I saw his toe in the moonlight, and the rest of his body being hidden in the shade. After this terrible freak of his, he was watched with much greater strictness, but I ought to observe, as some excuse for the keeper's negligence, that this was the first act of violence he had ever attempted.